Roguelikes are a pretty popular genre of game, so I'm going to challenge myself to try and make one in a month, or at least see how far I can get. Now, my experience with roguelikes and roguelites is somewhat non-existent outside of a few hours of Enter the Gungeon and Returnal, which should make this interesting and add some extra challenge. So I'm already developing a mobile game, which I've been doing for about 3 years now, but I'd like to take a small break and add another game release to my portfolio. I also have to justify spending $150 a year on my Apple developer's license. So I need a quick way to generate some revenue if I'm somewhat lucky. This was after I decided I would never make another mobile game, ever, after completing this one. So we're making a mobile game. To speed up the process and ease my workload, I'm going to try to do this using royalty-free assets, which will also be a first for me. I started this challenge by looking through Kenny's free assets, just to come up with an idea, and then I settled on this tiny dungeon pack and then started brainstorming some ideas. Procedural generation is a pretty ambitious concept for me and something I've never done before. So before I even started the challenge, I wanted to spend some time figuring it out and asked my buddy ChatGPT to help me out. After several attempts, ChatGPT never actually generated me a script that works, which I expected and is probably also for the best. However, it was in a very useful way, pointing me in the right direction I needed to go. I could start incorporating certain concepts it was trying to attempt and then modifying it to my specific requirements. I wanted to avoid rooms that for the most part felt generated, where they're perfect squares that slotted right next to each other, and also avoid rooms that were just kind of like a random mess. The inspiration mainly came from Enter the Gungeon. Even though the dungeons are randomly generated, each single room is handcrafted. So on and off for almost a couple weeks, I slowly and casually worked and chipped away at creating the system and algorithm for spawning rooms till it just felt right to the best of my ability. The generator starts at the home room, which will be some kind of pub with NPCs, with an entrance to the dungeon. Then it will start randomly spawning rooms in different directions. I added a few extra rules to this algorithm for it to roll back and spawn from previous rooms by storing each room in an array. This will prevent the generation from getting stuck and going snake on itself. We'll also do this randomly to create new offshoots and paths. The general idea of how to create the dungeon mainly came from ChatGPT, as it was trying to tell me to use multi-dimensional arrays to create a sort of grid, which essentially stores coordinates of the rooms that have already been spawned. When a room is spawned, it will get the max height and width and write it into this array and check off all the blocks it is occupying. It will then pick a pre-made room for the next generation, then choose one of the 4 exit ways of the last spawned room and try to place it next to it by using the new room's height and width again, and checking if it will fit the space or collide with another, or even if it goes out of bounds. If it's successful, it will place the room and then draw a corridor between the 2 exit ways. If unsuccessful, it will try the previous room's exit way in another direction. If that fails, it will roll back a few rooms and then try to spawn the next room somewhere else. Happy with the algorithm, I decided I wanted to commit to this project. Then I set a start date in about a month's time to basically do this over all of July. So I somehow missed the 1st of July and started on Sunday the 2nd of July. The first week mainly consisted of setting up the basics. I was finally able to use the sprite sheet and get the tile map set up, which was pretty exciting, getting a visual of everything instead of using these white blocks. I then quickly set up the player to do the squash and stretch animation using Unity's built-in animator with a very South Park inspired hop for the walks, as the sprites in the asset pack only have 1 frame of animation, or basically no animation in other words. Movement was mainly set up using Unity's new input system, allowing for me to configure these on-screen buttons, which also corresponded to the controller input if the player connects the controller to their phone. Continued expanding on the player's movement and animations by creating these 4 attack directions for melee and having the object rotate to point when the player is using a staff to shoot spells using the right stick. When the player isn't shooting magic spells and is using the melee mode, the right stick will be used to do the slide attack and lunge at enemies instead. Enemies are created using the A-star nav mesh system to track and follow the player. As you can see, the blue area will be the navigation area for the enemies to move around, while this part will be registered as an obstacle, which also, like these barrels, which the enemies will avoid and move around and then follow straight to the player, inevitably to their own death. The second week of development was the more exciting week, as I was lucky enough to be off work for a full week, because I work full-time normally and I've been doing this mainly in my spare time after work. I was able to spend most of the week fully working on the game. In the first 2 days, I then proceeded to develop what I had already started in the previous week, but a little bit more deeper. Instead of objects just being destroyed, I set up the foundation for combat, with the stats for health, defense, and other stats for the player and enemies, followed by particles, knockback, and spell shooting systems for the player. Next was creating covers for the entrances of each rooms that aren't in use. As you can see here, each room has 4 doors, but when a corridor isn't connected, we want to be able to hide it, so I created these little tile maps that sit on top of the existing ones with some colliders. Now surprisingly, this took me a while to get the functionality of it going, as I had to try figure out the workings with my existing dungeon generator, which I should have accounted for, but really didn't. But after several hours of trying, analyzing, and careful surgeon-like precision, I managed to squeeze it in like a glove. Now with that done, I was able to make it so that the corridors would also draw the correct tiles and create their own box colliders, and then stitch it together for a complete dungeon with only one room variation so far. But moving forward, I was able to make the barrels breakable so they drop items that the player can pick up, including coins, a special resource called dust, and items to refuel the player's health, magic, and energy. Since I started with these pickups, I need to create some sort of UI around them. So when the player takes damage, their health drops. When magic is used up while using a staff to shoot spells, the magic bar is used up, and energy is used up when the player uses their slide attack with the sword. Since the asset pack has no UI, I had to create one centered around what colors were already in the asset pack itself. I then spent the rest of the week and weekend designing different rooms for generation, and then also creating the end room goal, which at this point when the player walks into, will just restart them to the back of the dungeon again. So the third week was a write-off. I was actually really busy every single evening after getting back to the old 9 to 5 grind, and when I eventually could work on the game again that week, I got sick right all the way up till the end of the next Monday. Getting right back on track, I started with a new enemy type. To introduce the more bullet hell style action, I started with this wizard enemy that will fire spells at you in the same vein as that the player can do. When they're about to fire, they will point their little staff at the player and shoot based on some adjustable variables, like how often between each shot and how many they can shoot at one time. Then when they are cooling down, they will reset their staff to the default position so you know that they're open for an attack. Ideally, I'll be able to modify this character more in the future, so there will be different and more complicated shooting patterns, which is why I also made it so that the player can dodge through these attacks. I then also made it so everyone has a detection range for the player to stop them from just gang rushing the player upon the entrance, which then led me to handling what happens when the player enters the room. I wanted to make a system that locks them inside, but I didn't have any kind of door sprites that would do so I worked up my own one with a couple of animations. This actually gave me a really good opportunity to try out a Unity package I've had my eye on for a really long time, called the Sprite Importer. Since I work solely with Sprite for all my sprites, in the past with my previous project Footjoust, I used to just create all the animations, then export each one as a sheet, then cut them all out, then drag the frames together to create a new animation, and then eventually add it to the animation controller. With this, it just picks up the Sprite file and has the animation controller and animations all ready to go based off the tags I've created. This will literally save me hours of busy work in the future. If you're using Sprite and haven't tried this, you are absolutely crazy. I then added these doors to the room, set them to appear when the entranceway covers disappeared, and then made them lock when the player enters the room. Once the player has defeated all the enemies in the room, the door will unlock again. But what I made sure to do was that any doors that were already opened or traveled through by the player will stay open like this after being locked up. And any ones that haven't been opened looked like this, so at a glance the player can navigate through rooms they've never been to before. On development of making the dungeon more navigable without getting lost, I also had to start out on making this little mini-map system. Something I've never done before. It took some time to figure out, but I basically just set up a second camera that follows the player around, but I set it to only see certain layers. Which means I had to draw another tile map underneath each room that only the camera could see. I did the same for the gates and then got the images to change color based on the status of being opened, locked, or unlocked. For now, I just left it there, and now I have a general idea of what to do before completing and expanding it. I then felt that the sprites from the asset pack were starting to get limited, and I wanted to create something more decorative and some more variation to each room. So I just drew up all these different sprites and then spread them around the room. With the end of the deadline coming up, I decided on my last task, which was creating another enemy type. One that can do melee attacks like the player, as opposed to the bat that just crashes into the player. Ideally, this enemy will spawn at a random set of weapons and armor, but for now it will be just a regular sword and this sprite. When it gets closer to the player, it will then play an attack animation and deal damage to the player, then cool down for a few seconds. So, with no surprise to anyone, even myself, I didn't get anywhere near finished. I did create a complete dungeon that you could crawl through, but with a lot of missing features. At the moment, the player can run and fight through the dungeon, and then get to the end, and once they get to the end, it'll restart back to the start again. In the complete version of the game, this would give the player some sort of skill point that they can add to any of their stats, and then it would increase how many rooms spawn in a dungeon, and they would just keep doing that until they keep leveling up. With that being said, I got reasonably far for about 3 weeks of actual work and also managing to get a build running smoothly on an iPhone 6s. It's hard to gauge how long it'll take to complete the rest of the game, maybe another month or 2, who knows. The good news is that a lot of the groundwork was done, and I still think that it can be done within a reasonable time frame. So with that challenge failed for the most part, you'll never guess what I'm doing next.